David, we've got a very interesting show today. I'm quite fascinated when topics that you've been discussing for over a decade basically play out before our very eyes. How are you today, David?
I'm very well, Jason. Good to be with you.
You are in the captured dominion of Canada. But what I'm talking about specifically, David, you've told us so much about the parallel narratives that are generated by the BBC, how this parallel narrative approach to injecting fake news or doing these type of double cross operations, it goes back to World War II. And I mean, we see it happening every day. It came to my attention when there was a story about this freshman congressional representative, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has introduced articles of impeachment to try to impeach President Stupid Joe. President Dumb Joe. And she's been met with a lot of opposition. It's interesting to observe, David, because, they're basically castigating her for making comments that sound very similar to things that you and I have spoken about. They were saying, or I should say, they're trying to make it look like she's a conspiracy theorist or something bad, particularly citing her claims that the fires in Paradise, California could have been started from satellites. What do you think about that, David?
Well, she's absolutely right. And in fact, it's not at all obvious that there's any other way of starting those particular fires, because these are probably amongst the first forest fires in history not to burn the forest. So if you look at the satellite image of Paradise, you can see that around, is it a township? What is Paradise? Is it a township, a village, or what is it?
I guess it's a township. I have to say, I had never heard of it before these fires. I've incorporated some satellite imagery from Maxar, David, into today's collage, and it illustrates exactly what you're talking about. I agree with you completely that when we have a circumstance that is so anomalous, like you said, there's a forest fire allegedly, but here's a rich, dense forest surrounding this neighborhood of houses. Doesn't look like a single tree is burnt. We even have houses within the neighborhood surrounded by burnt houses with trees very near them, and certain houses have been spared. How can this possibly be explained?
Well, very easily, because if we look at some of these characters associated with the faith in global warming, that it's driven by catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, and we come back to Pierre Trudeau, around the late 70s, he appears to have commissioned probably the greatest spy master the world has ever seen, a guy called John McDonnell, right, to build systems that would integrate satellite data processing with mobile data management. And there is John McDonnell. He died in 2019, but back in 1969, it looks like Pierre Trudeau commissioned John McDonnell as his International Joint Conference on Artificial Intelligence spy master to integrate systems that would allow people like Trudeau to track actors on the ground, live action role players, arsonists, guerrillas, revolutionaries, etc., and run surveillance on the crime scene through this very powerful satellite signal data capability. And if we go back to the idea that they want us to believe in catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, one good way of doing that is taking the odd township and burning it to the ground. But the anomaly, as you point out, is that in the case of Paradise, there are trees standing within the township that look green to me. I don't know whether that color was added, but there are houses that are actually obliterated. And the only way of generating the temperatures that could obliterate a house is hitting the cabling within the system with microwave energy. And if you put a piece of metal in a microwave, you get sparking.
Yes.
Right? Well, sparking is very, very hot. Now, what John McDonnell could do is, using artificial intelligence, he could take a group of geostationary satellites and beam or focus energy from monolithic microwave integrated circuits of the type made by Nanowave in Ottawa into a house, generate the sparks, burn the house to the ground. If you hit a car with this, you'll get the car will go sparking inside. They probably want to get real witnesses well away from it who might otherwise blow the whistle on that. But then ultimately you get the pooled aluminium, melted aluminium lying in the street. So this is a classic example of a parallel narrative where the BBC is directing you to believe in, well, for example, global warming, while running a live action role play with actors, some criminal, that are actually helping to hide evidence. There we are. I mean, a forest. Look, there's the trees behind it. This is absolutely absurd. Over to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's just it. I've noticed it's a pattern that, right, this car has been so superheated that we literally see what appears to be liquid metal. I mean, this is like the tire here has melted. So very often tires, or I should say wheels on cars, are made out of aluminum, so they'll be light. And this looks very much like melted aluminum to me. Aluminum's quite pliable and meltable. And I agree with you. How could it possibly melt without these trees catching on fire? And
or may I just jump in there?
Yeah.
Or the rubber. You see, the rubber is a organic material. If you put rubber into a microwave, it's not going to spark.
Right.
So the tire is not burnt, but the aluminum is melted.
Right. I mean, this is astounding. And so basically what we've got is the BBC and its counterparts in mainstream media, which I wanted to ask you this, David. We've been focusing on the BBC, but it seems almost like BBC was the inventor of this technique, and that other news agencies, I mean, the New York Times had the BBC's former director general as its CEO in Mark Thompson. So is it safe to say that a lot of these major international news agencies have followed the BBC model and are essentially now doing the same thing?
Well, they're fed with the BBC feed goes around the world. Remember, the BBC has a weekly audience of 500 million people, and it uses 50 languages. And of course, it goes back to 1928 or so. And the propaganda of World War II, a classic example of a parallel narrative, would be Operation Mincemeat. And I'm not going to go off on a tangent here, but there you have an alumnus of UBC, James Sinclair, right, who worked with the Royal Canadian Air Force in the attack on Sicily, where the BBC was running a double cross operation, getting the Germans to believe the attack was in Greece. So they moved 90,000 men into the wrong place for the invasion. Over to you.
Well, I think it's important that we remind people that James Sinclair is the father of Justin Trudeau's mother.
Yes.
And he is also a very decorated Canadian war hero. And there's so much that seems to have gone on around World War II and Nazism. I've been listening to the book on tape, The Devil's Chessboard, that talks a lot about the formation of the CIA and specifically Alan Dulles' basically enthusiasm for Nazis and bringing Nazis over to the United States, integrating them in the CIA, into NASA, the health industrial complex. We know that Ochsner Medical Center is the biggest medical group there in Louisiana. So it seems, David, like this underground group of war-mongering, chaos-loving, Nazi-involved, like Nazis versus communists, Antifa versus Proud Boys. There always is this kind of like, binary fight that's happening.
Yeah.
What's going on with all these guys?
Yeah. Let me just jump in there. So we can go off at a tangent and look at Black Lives Matter or Antifa, but I think it's important, coming back to the BBC, to realize that during World War II, when George Orwell was working at the BBC, and soon afterwards, he wrote his book 1984, and in 1984, he described the inner party. And I would say that the BBC has an inner party of propagandists that is shaping the collective view of incidents like global warming or paradise or the spread of COVID. So these people they are fundamentally based in a parallel narrative technique. And I don't say it was invented by the BBC, but it was certainly perfected by the BBC, where you inject news into the collective conscience of what you want people to believe, like in global warming, while simultaneously sending digital blocking notes to live action role players or criminals at the crime scene to remove evidence of what you've just done. So, for example, the people that went into Paradise afterwards, had they been, let's say, firefighters experienced in arson analysis, they would have looked at what we've just seen, and the audience have seen, and the whole world should be up in arms about it, is that the rubber tires are not burnt, but the aluminum is melted on the ground. That is clear evidence of what I would call spoliation of a crime scene, because the investigators into the Paradise fires did not identify that as an anomaly and solve the crime. And this was electromagnetic radiation directed by a number of geostationary satellites under control of artificial intelligence algorithms, directed by the successors to John McDonnell, which I would suggest is now Justin Trudeau. Because Justin Trudeau, he was also at UBC, right? He's now the Prime Minister of Canada. He has his access to all of those technologies necessary to put on a parallel narrative, including the parallel narrative that relates to the asymptomatic carriers of the virus, which is presently shutting down economies in the Five Eyes community, but not touching now, apparently, the communist Chinese. Over to you.
Yeah. And it's interesting, David, I've also included in today's collage not just the high-resolution satellite image of Paradise, but we've also got the BBC Broadcasting House here. And, the other thing that they've been very instrumental in trying to debunk, and it becomes so complicated because I agree that this thing related to the 17th letter of the alphabet is not what people think it is, but it's tied to these statements where they claim it's a debunked conspiracy theory that says that pedophiles control the world and all the things that they basically say. But of course, when we look at the BBC Broadcasting House, this is not a statue I would put on my broadcasting house. It's certainly suggestive of an approval of pedophilia. And the other thing our collage includes is a little glimpse at the warning that people should listen and obey.
Yeah, and if you could go back to that, the bearded man that appears to be in some unnatural, terrible relationship with a naked child. If you saw a bearded man in the street doing that to a naked child, you'd arrest him, right? But look what they're standing on. They're standing on the globe. What this means to me is that the BBC has created an international pedophile ring, aided and abetted by people like Justin Trudeau, who, if you remember, his roommate, Christopher Charles Ingvelson, was charged, arrested, and jailed as the director of an international pedophile ring, probably from 1997 to 2010. And my question is, did Justin Trudeau ever dismantle that network? I don't think he did. I think that network is still in place, and it's driven by the BBC under that listen and obey mantra, right? That is to say, if you don't do what you're told, you may be accused of being a pedophile. All right. And we can frame you through the internet such that it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for you to prove that you were actually a victim of a live action role play in some hotel. Over to you.
Right. And just to expand a bit on what you're saying, I don't know that they're necessarily suggesting that they could frame you as anything specifically, but the point is they can frame you, that is to say, put you in a narrative frame to tell whatever story they want about you. And in the case of this freshman congressional representative, the story that they want to tell is that she's a conspiracy theorist and nothing that she's saying should be listened to. She should be dismissed as crazy. It's the same thing that they tried to do to President Trump. No matter how much evidence, no matter how many facts, you're talking about empirical scientific evidence. How can a forest fire explain melting aluminum when the rubber is unmelted? There simply is no explanation for that other than microwave energy. And BBC positions this as the woman's crazy, but I think it's quite clear that this technology exists.
And so let's flip to the virus. Okay, so it would appear that Pierre Trudeau and Bill Clinton, beginning in the 1980s, developed a prison blood trade where the blood was processed in Canada and then shipped abroad and basically transmitted Hep C and AIDS into the global community. Probably, I would describe this as a crime against humanity. And then you have these two clowns. There's Pierre Trudeau, and there's Bill, right? Side by side on your nearly side by side on your collage, who have actually injected viruses into the global community in a manner consistent with targeting certain countries to be infected and certain countries to be purged of the virus, like China, and other countries to be infected, particularly the Five Eyes countries, in a manner that suggests they have actually shut down. Remember the Chinese promise to blind the Five Eyes? I think the United States now, you are actually witnessing of your Five Eyes connections with Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia have been blinded. Right?
As
so they're now threatened.
In the BBC.
Yes, through the BBC. And this man, Dr. Cameron Ortis, who's presently languishing in jail, and he did his thesis on compromised nodes and cybersecurity in East Asia. I think he discovered that Justin Trudeau was running these rackets with his partners, and that's why Justin Trudeau has had him put in jail and held incommunicado, so he can't explain exactly what he discovered. I think Cameron Ortis discovered that there was a international pedophile ring that was compromising nodes in the Five Eyes countries and actually extorting or blackmailing its leaders into keeping their mouths shut. Over to you.
Right. And for the first time in a while, there's been some new reporting on what's going on with Cameron Ortis. I do want to remind everybody, David, that we're just about 15 minutes away from our sponsor exclusive segment that's going to begin at 1:30 p.m. today, East Coast time, on subscribestar.com/reverse-CSI, patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, and subscribestar.com and patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I do want to welcome everybody back, David. This is our first show on the Jason Goodman YouTube channel in several weeks. You and I have discussed extensively on the show how social engineers are constantly trying to shut us down. This is one of the main reasons why we created this direct-to-viewer sponsorship program where people can enjoy us on platforms that the social engineers have not yet been successful in getting us removed. But it's so important, David, because the other parallel I want to draw people's attention to is there seems to be a parallel between the social engineering activity that happens against Crowdsource the Truth in this show and the social engineering that happened to President Trump and now Marjorie Taylor Greene and even Dr. Cameron Ortis. And I say this because you've told us a lot, David, about how we can track narratives, or rather understand narratives by tracking characters. And likewise, we can understand characters by tracking narratives. I allege, David, by remaining engaged with these social engineers for as long as we have, which is years now, we've really exceeded the amount of time that they normally take to thwart their opposition. And it's causing certain things to be revealed that I think are helping us understand both the narrative and the characters better.
Yeah, and if I may, let me just talk about that upgrade of the security risk from high to severe. A high security risk to the Five Eyes countries means a leak, A severe one actually means an existential threat to the Five Eyes countries. You, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom are looking at economic oblivion because we are not responding to this threat in the proper way. This man should be out in front of the public explaining to him what compromised nodes he identified in the Trudeau administration. And I can guarantee you that what he has found, to my horror, is that the artificial intelligence techniques that I pioneered back in the 1980s have actually been or gone rogue on us, right? They are now looking at the destruction and the oblivion of the Five Eyes economies, and they're extraordinarily successful. Over to you.
Right. And Cameron Ortis is going to be definitely a focus of our conversation when we make the transition over to the sponsor exclusive segment, because there's a number of strange anomalies about this. I haven't really heard anybody else talking about Cameron Ortis as much as you and I have. I don't know if Justin Trudeau watches Crowdsource the Truth, or perhaps he's a sponsor on Subscribestar or Patreon. I guess I would know if he was sponsoring. But the point of the matter is, this guy's been in custody for like a year and a half. And I mean, if it's so severe, why did it take them that long to upgrade it from September of 2019 to January of 2021? They don't seem to be investigating that carefully.
Yeah, and let me respond to that. We only know a couple of days or 3 days ago that it was upgraded from high to severe. So it may not have been upgraded immediately after he's arrested. It may be as a result of the work you and I have done in exposing the likelihood that Cameron Ortis had actually penetrated this artificial intelligence road network assembled for Pierre Trudeau by John MacDonald, and realized that there was a threat coming from the present Prime Minister of Canada to the United States. And in fact, I believe the various attacks on the United States have actually been driven out of a test bed developed in Vancouver and up at UBC. This man is the crown jewels of the investigation into crimes like the destruction of paradise or the spread of the virus from the prison blood trade. Over to you.
Basically anything that's been covered by a parallel narrative.
Correct.
Perhaps, he was investigating. Ortis's PhD thesis focuses on this concept of compromised nodes. And again, this is something that a lot of questions keep coming up about. I encourage people to go back and watch the previous shows and even, get onto the sponsor platform to educate themselves about this. But what was it, David, in your opinion, that Ortis meant with this term compromised nodes?
Well, I think he discovered ways of blinding the Five Eyes countries by compromising nodes. Maybe it helps people. I had a phrase, talking about the BBC, that the BBC is always injecting news through infected nodes, where infected is basically another term for compromise. If you can take a node within the Vancouver Police Department or the RCMP and infiltrate pedophile blackmailers into the RCMP and the Vancouver Police, or the FBI or the CIA, wouldn't that be interesting if you wanted to do a raid on Starnet, which was running an international pedophile ring with hardcore adult and child pornography in 60 countries? You could then tell these people to assemble a team of 150 law enforcement officers and take away all of the evidence of these compromised nodes from Starnet. So I think that's what Dr. Ortis had discovered. And he discovered that a key player was Justin Trudeau and his online roommate. I think they were both directing an international pedophile ring that has now got inside the Five Eyes Signals Intelligence Network and is able to shut down investigations, right, and deflect people into fake or mythical activities like, chasing carbon dioxide as the principal component of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. And interestingly, carbon dioxide is the gas that makes those trees in paradise green. So it's,
right.
It's absurd beyond belief.
Well, not only that, David, you're hitting on a topic that's a recurring theme. When I observed Alan Dershowitz having his debate with Robert Kennedy Jr., I thought that Dershowitz did something in extremely poor taste, mentioning the murder of Robert Kennedy's father. And the context in which he did it was to reinforce the mainstream news story that Sirhan shot him because Sirhan was a Palestinian upset about the Kennedy brothers' policies towards Israel. This is something that obviously serves the interests of Israel and the mainstream in general. And it's interesting that Dershowitz is carrying that water for them. But I think there are a number of persistent themes that the BBC and other water carriers for the mainstream want people to really believe and never question. They want them to absculta. We're almost out of time, David, and we're going to begin our sponsor exclusive deep dive into some more of these things. But just our discovery on the fly process has caused me to think of one other thing I'm going to want to talk to you about. This raid of Starnet Communications, it made the news in the online gambling world because, of course, Starnet, in addition to producing child pornography and hardcore pornography, was also involved in online gaming. A whistleblower who was formerly employed there has told us that they actually were very likely cheating, that there were people who were involved in this gambling. And then flash forward to 2021, we've got this article from the CBC about how a high-stakes gambler has set the authorities on the trail of this very sophisticated counterintelligence expert. It seems strange that a gambler is trusted, and we've seen the video testimony from this R.J. Cipriani. We'll get into detail on this during the sponsor exclusive show, David, but anything to take us out with regard to all these gamblers that seem to be involved in sinking Cameron Ortis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, just coming back to that idea of injecting news through infected nodes. If you have an infected node, you can use insider trading, or you can set up the casino so that your friends win, basically launder some money, right? And your enemies lose. So this is exactly what happened in Richmond, with the Riverboat Casino, and created what is called the Vancouver model. And I think that John McDonnell, commissioned by Pierre Trudeau, created the technology for the Vancouver model, which allows you to operate what I call Ijkai Murder Inc. That is to say, artificial intelligence algorithms are being programmed to take out the enemies of these people, right? Now, they don't kill all of them. Ridicule works pretty well, or basically a loss of reputation, like this the Congresswoman that you're talking about. Most people don't have the technical depth that can stand up to identify the anomaly, which we've done today. Like there's a tire that's not burned, and there's aluminum, the molten aluminum is obviously poured into the street. That is an anomaly that requires actually a minimum amount of scientific literacy to say, how do you produce that anomaly? How do you explain it? And then we, that is to say our Patreon supporters, are well on the way to identifying the criminal movement or criminal organization behind it. And I believe we need to get Cameron Ortis in a habeas corpus court to explain what nodes he had identified. And I think he will find that those compromised nodes are directed by Justin Trudeau. Over to you.
And we're going to get even more in depth on this topic and more. The, rigging the gambling sounds an awful lot like what's going on with Robinhood and GameStop and all that. But these all seem to be standard techniques. We're going to see everybody in just 2 minutes on Patreon and Subscribestar. Please join us, and thanks for watching.